She wrote, "Nearly all night long I listened to a woman cry and beg for God to let her die. Another woman yelled murder at the top of her lungs." What she saw inside that building was filled with horror. Nellie Bly, a 23-year-old journalist, went undercover to expose a New York City asylum in 1887, and let's dive into this case in story form. Nellie Bly was actually born Nellie Cochran in 1864. She had piercing hazel eyes and rich brown hair that was always put up in a bun. It was her first year as a journalist, and she was hungry for any assignment she could go on. On September 22, 1887, she sat down with her editor at the New York World, the American newspaper that originated in 1860. Her editor proposed that she write an expose on Blackwell Asylum. This was going to be a huge story. "I want to know everything, how the patients are treated, how they're managed, what the conditions are like." She had faith in herself that she could complete the task, but she had heard horror stories of the abuses and negligence inside Blackwell. "Well, how are you going to get me out once I'm inside?" It was easy to get admitted to Blackwell, but getting out was nearly impossible. "That I don't know, but I guess we'll have to reveal your identity to do so," the editor said. He gave her a piece of paper with a different name on it, Nellie Brown. He told her that her last name was going to be Brown, so no one would recognize it since she was a journalist. And with that, he left her to prepare for this assignment all on her own. That week, she stayed at a boarding house for women and was assessed by a doctor who didn't need much convincing to send her to Blackwell. Blackwell Asylum first opened as a prison in 1832 on East River Island. It housed patients with diseases and physical ailments. Then it started accepting patients with disabilities that prevented them from taking care of themselves, and turned into an asylum in 1839. One cold, brisk morning, as Nellie stepped out of the wagon and looked up, she saw the dark, crumbling stone building. The stench in the air made her cover her nose. It was Blackwell Asylum. The air smelled sour and musty for some reason, and just then, a nurse walked over to the group Nellie was with and greeted them. Nellie, completely nervous and not knowing what to expect, walked inside. The building did, in fact, look like a prison. This was it. This was her first day. Once admitted to Blackwell, it was extremely difficult to leave the asylum grounds. Even if you were to prove your sanity, it wouldn't make a difference if they refused to listen, which they often did. The male patients were transferred to a different facility on the island, but Blackwell was still crowded. It housed 300 women, but it was only meant to house 200 patients in all. As Nellie kept walking deeper into the building, she was hit with a tinge of panic. She had no idea how her editor was going to get her out. The dread of spending more than 10 days inside the asylum filled her with misery. Dr. Kinnear approached the group. He would be evaluating the women that just arrived. A woman who came with Nellie, Louise Shans, who spoke very little English, was told that she'd be staying there for a while. She was German and had a hard time understanding what the doctors and nurses were saying, and she had such a hard time making herself understood. Another woman named Mrs. Maynard was led away even though she kept pleading with them that she was perfectly sane, perfectly sound. Louise, struggling to communicate, began to sob. She didn't want to be there, but they wouldn't listen to any of them. When it was time for Nellie to be examined, she noticed that the doctor and nurse paid little attention to her. They kept flirting right in front of her, and they were dismissing everything that Nellie was saying. "I'm not sick. I don't want to stay here," she told them. But they looked at her as if she said the most horrifying thing in the world. Even though everything inside looked clean and orderly, Nellie couldn't help but feel that horrible things were about to happen. After the examination, she heard someone yell, "Go out into the hall," and just then, patients flooded the hallway. One patient came over to her and told her that supper was about to be served, so Nellie stood up and followed everyone else. When the group of women entered the hall, Nellie and some of the others started to shiver. They were standing right in front of a door that led to the cafeteria. It was so cold they could see their breath right in front of them, and when Nellie looked over at the barred window, it was wide open, letting in the cold, damp air. They were all crowded in front of the locked door leading to the cafeteria, and when Nellie looked around at the group of women, some were sobbing, some were talking to themselves, and some had a distant expression on their faces. She felt extremely guilty and sorry for the way they were being managed. There was no care given, nor any tenderness inside the walls of Blackwell. After waiting half an hour, a nurse entered the hall and unlocked the door to the cafeteria. They were given marching orders to get in line 2 by 2. Nellie obediently listened, and when she looked around her, those that immediately didn't get in line were either shoved, pushed, or even slapped on the ear by the attendants because they weren't fast enough. As soon as the group entered the dining hall, which was a large room with long wooden tables and backless benches, there was a mad dash. On the table were cups with pink liquid in them that was supposed to be tea, 5 prunes next to the cups, and buttered bread. Women were fighting over the meal, even taking the share of others, and when Nellie's own food was taken from her, a woman sitting across from her offered her own meal to Nellie, but Nellie politely refused. When she asked the attendant for more food, the attendant told her, "If you forgot where your home was, you surely didn't forget to eat, now did you?" When Nellie took a bite of the buttered bread that was given to her, she immediately spit it out. The bread was dry but moist in places, and the butter had a very sour taste to it, and it was light brown. And on the edge of the crust, she saw the dried up leg that belonged to a spider. A woman that was watching Nellie told her, "You know, you can ask for unbuttered bread next time," she said with a smile. Nellie smiled back at her and picked up the tea that tasted like warm water. She ate a few of the prunes and gave them to a woman that asked for them. After supper, they were all ushered to a cold, wet bathroom down the hall. The attendant who took the group of women there announced that it was their bath time, and that really freaked out Nellie. Nellie was the first to be forced out of her clothes, even though she protested. She begged for them to take the other women away, but she was just told to shut up. They told her that if she didn't do what they said, they wouldn't be so gentle. So in front of all the women, Nellie was stripped out of her clothing by 2 attendants and told to get inside the tub. She jumped in as quickly as she could, considering she was naked in front of the group of women that were standing in the corner watching her. The water was unbearably ice cold, and when Nellie looked at the attendant approaching her, she saw the attendant was holding a discolored rag. She braced herself as the attendant started to scrub her skin ferociously, only using a speck of soap. Nellie's teeth started to chatter, and then they dumped a bucket of ice-cold water on top of her head. And when Nellie looked over at the other women, they looked horrified, knowing that they were next. They were given a bath once a week, and that is the only time they ever saw soap. After the bath, Nellie was given an itchy flannel slip that resembled a potato sack. On the back of the slip were the words, "Insane Asylum, Blackwell Island, Hall 6, that was stitched onto it. As she was putting on the slip, she heard the attendant scold another patient for asking them to be more gentle. She was led to a room with 6 beds, and when Nellie sat down on one of them, another attendant rushed inside the room and dragged her out. "I heard you're too noisy. You're going to be inside a room alone," the attendant told her. Room 28 is where Nellie would be sleeping. The bed looked lumpy and broken. The walls were bare and crumbling. It was so cold inside. "Can I have a nightgown? I'm too cold in this," Nellie said, pointing to her flannel slip. The attendant looked at her and scoffed rudely. She told Nellie that they don't provide nightgowns at this institution, and when Nellie protested, saying that the city pays them to provide good care for their patients, the attendant looked at her and told her, "I don't care. You should be thankful for what you get here. You don't need to expect any kindness around here because you won't get it, I can tell you that much." Nellie sat quietly and watched the attendant leave. She put her head against the pillow, which was now damp, and closed her eyes, wondering why she even took on this assignment. After an hour passed, she heard loud footsteps approaching, and then she heard the loud clicks of the locks to each door being turned. And when the footsteps stopped right outside Nellie's room, the door opened. It was a night attendant who told her that every night the doors were to be locked. The windows were barred, there was no escape. Nellie nodded and put her head back on the pillow. She tried to sleep, but she couldn't. Every hour she heard loud footsteps, giggling, laughing, right outside her door. Their heavy footsteps kept going up and down the hallway every hour. It was as if they didn't want the patients to sleep at all. If there was a fire at Blackwell, there would be no way the attendants could free all the patients in time. Several hours had passed, and Nellie noticed the sun peeking through the navy blue sky, and she heard birds right outside the barred window. She hadn't slept all night and was just getting drowsy. But just then, she heard her door unlock and burst open. A nurse came in and threw a wad of clothes onto the floor and yelled at Nellie to get dressed quickly. It was a scratchy cotton dress with black stains all over it and an underskirt. She got dressed and was led into the bathroom where the other patients were washing their faces. Only 2 towels were provided for the 45 women. Some had sores on their faces, others did not, but they kept using the same towel, one right after the other. Nellie walked over to the farthest sink in the bathroom and washed her face quickly, and then she used her underskirt to wipe the water because she wasn't going to use those towels. As she was about to leave the bathroom, an attendant yelled at her to stay and wait for the combing. Confused, she stood in the corner, and after 45 minutes, 2 attendants along with a patient came in holding 6 combs. All 45 heads were being combed with those. Nellie tried to protest, saying that her hair was fine, but she was yanked down to the floor, and a nurse started to comb her hair aggressively. Afterwards, they were given a repulsive breakfast, and those that couldn't sit upright or fidgeted too much were given the punishment of sitting on those backless benches from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. Those that weren't punished were granted the permission of going outside for their daily walk in the afternoon. When it came time for her walk, Nellie stepped out into the brisk, cold afternoon air, and she tried not to gasp. She was surrounded by groups of women from different halls that were being guarded by nurses. They were severely ill. They had vacant expressions, they kept whispering things to themselves, and when Nellie asked who they were, she was told that they were the most violent patients on the island. Nellie knew this wasn't true. She heard one woman screaming at a nurse, asking her why she was being beaten by her and why the nurse wanted to kill her. She saw another woman in a straitjacket being dragged by 2 nurses. What little time they had outside was not meant to be enjoyable. They weren't even allowed on the grass. They couldn't even touch the grass. If someone picked up a leaf off the ground, it was immediately confiscated. After the walk, the women were led inside the sitting room where they waited for dinner. They waited hours. For dinner, there was boiled fish or boiled beef and potatoes. Nellie choked it down, and when the patients were headed back to their rooms after dinner, Nellie walked past the kitchen and noticed the attendants, nurses, and doctors feasting on braised beef and fruit of every kind with fresh bread. This made her heart sink because she knew that the patients were being severely mistreated. She was taking note of everything, every mistreatment, every punishment, every cruelty. And that was the end of her first day. Because the ward was so cold, many of the women started to get sick. They had a high fever. They were too weak to get up out of bed. But the nurses did nothing. Nellie could hear the cries of women all night long, begging for mercy, begging for death. No care was given. The next morning, while everyone was waiting for breakfast, one woman walked into the sitting room on the verge of tears. Nellie watched her sit down on the bench and asked them what they were doing to her, that she was too cold to sleep. The head nurse that was in the room walked over to the woman and placed her hand on the woman's cheek. And when the woman started crying, the nurse let out a cruel laugh. She didn't care. Nellie could feel her blood boil. In the next few days, she witnessed the women being choked and beaten so badly they got black eyes by the nurses. All because the patients were either crying too much or they were speaking too loudly to the nurses. Some patients were even locked inside closets as punishment. But the nurses hid this from the doctors, and when the doctors asked the nurses why their patients were bruised and had black eyes, the nurses told the doctors that the patients did this to themselves. They would just lie. The patients were expected to clean the nurses' quarters, the hallways, kitchen, rooms. One patient cleaned the entire kitchen floor, and when she was finished, a nurse walked in, picked up a bag of flour, and poured it all over the floor so the patient could clean it up. Some women had dreams of reuniting with their family once again, only to wake up in their broken, lumpy bed surrounded by crumbling walls, shivering and crying. On the 6th day, one afternoon, Nellie was beaten so badly for no reason at all that the nurse broke 2 of her ribs. On another day, they tortured a young girl after beating her very badly and placed her in the cold tub naked. She was sick and had a high fever, but they didn't care. After the bath, they threw the girl in her room without giving her any clothes, and when morning came, she was deceased. Some patients weren't even given water to drink until their mouth was so dry and parched that they were unable to speak. By the 10th day, with no reason given, Nellie was isolated and shut off from any visitors. Not that anyone did come to see her. But that afternoon, Nellie was outside on her daily walk when she was approached by an attendant and a lawyer. Nellie was confused, thinking that maybe her identity had been discovered, But the lawyer named Peter Hendricks told Nellie that some of her friends would be willing to look after her if she didn't want to stay at the asylum any longer. This was a lie to prevent her identity from being leaked, and just like that, Nellie said her goodbyes to the patients that she had befriended, and she was immediately put on a boat headed towards the mainland. She felt so incredibly guilty leaving the women behind. Some were perfectly sane, and others were extremely ill. After Nellie's release, she wrote an article about her experience at Blackwell Asylum, which was published and met with so much controversy. People were shocked and absolutely disgusted by how the patients were being treated. The grand jury launched an investigation where Nellie stood before the grand jury, telling them about what she had seen, how she was being treated, about all the horrific things. She urged the grand jury to increase the budget for facilities like Blackwell. The day Nellie stepped out of the wagon and onto Blackwell Island, she began to act like herself. The more sane she acted, the poorly she was treated by the Blackwell staff. When investigators visited the island with Nellie to see for themselves, magically everything was different. It was better. The kitchen was stocked with fresh food, the hallways and rooms were no longer unbearably cold, and the patients that Nellie spoke of were mysteriously transferred to a different facility on the island. It was as if everything was wiped clean after the article was published. Because of what Nellie discovered and told the grand jury, an increase of $1 million was added to the budget to better the conditions of asylums. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any more stories. And I'll see you in the next one.